Solo Leveling by Gong. Chapter 12. Igris the Bloodred. Boom! The doors to the boss's lair opened. It was dark inside, and even with Jinwoo's heightened eyesight thanks to his perception stat, it was hard to see far. He could barely make out what he was standing on. The ground was covered in stone slates that were neatly arranged. The interlocking gray slabs made the room feel cold regardless of the actual temperature. As soon as he stepped on one, whoosh, countless torches on the wall flared up at once and illuminated the area. Like I thought, it's similar to what happened in the underground temple. Jinwoo was alert as he cautiously moved forward, taking in the room. Giant pillars stood to either side, and at the far end was a large throne. It's just like a king's throne room from a movie, except the scale was exponentially larger. When Jinwoo ventured farther inside, the doors slammed shut. Slam! Jinwoo glanced back but wasn't surprised, as he'd been waiting for that to happen. He continued to advance. I'm sensing a formidable presence. Something was telling him he had to reach the throne to complete the job change quest, and his hunches were rarely wrong in this kind of situation. Before he could reach his destination, though, a mysterious figure emerged from behind a pillar 10 paces away and blocked his path. Thump, thump, thud. The creature stopped and turned to face Jinwoo. Gulp. Jinwoo swallowed hard. It was clear from the name that appeared in red above its head that Jinwoo was in the presence of the boss, Knight Commander Igris the Bloodred. It was a knight in a red suit of armor. The armor Igris wore was similar to the previous knights, but unlike the simple-minded lackeys, Igris seemed rather sharp. Its helmet in particular caught Jinwoo's eye. It sported a long, horse-like red mane that stretched from its top and went down the back. As he inspected the helmet, Jinwoo spotted another difference. Are those eyes? He wasn't sure if he should call them eyes or pupils, but regardless, dim silver lights glowed where its eyes should have been. They felt cold and almost mechanical. An icy gaze was fixed on Jinwoo. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Was this the presence I felt before? Defeating this knight could very well be the objective of the job change quest, which meant he should proceed with caution. He raised his fists and took a fighting stance as he kept an eye on Igris's movements. My dagger wouldn't work on it anyway. Blunt force was what he needed to defeat knights. Igris, who had been silently gazing at Jinwoo, suddenly removed its cloak. Thump! The cloak fell to the ground. What's it doing? The odd display didn't end there. Igris then unbelted its sword from its waist and two daggers from behind it, holding them up one by one before dropping them on the ground. It was almost like it wanted Jinwoo to be aware of what it was doing. Clank! Clang! The sound of metal hitting stone echoed throughout the vast lair. Upon discarding its weapons, Igris raised its fists and took a similar fighting stance, as if mocking Jinwoo. Jinwoo was flabbergasted. Was Igris planning to engage him with its fists just because Jinwoo himself was? Jinwoo bit his bottom lip. It's looking down on me. At the potential provocation, Jinwoo's face began heating up. The more intense his emotions were, the more worked up he became. As fast as his heart was pounding, his eyes were laser-focused. Bring it! As if Igris had read Jinwoo's mind, the knight charged at him. TMP, 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 TMP. Igris moved so quickly, it was hard to believe it was wearing armor. The armor speed penalty only affects those with a strength stat less than 80, which meant that the knight's strength was at least 80. The way Igris moved, its agility also matched that of a high-rank hunter. When it was close, Igris leaped into the air. TMP! It aimed its knee at Jinwoo's face. It's fast. But Jinwoo was ready, pushing his reflex speed to the max. He bent backward at a nearly 90-degree angle to avoid the attack, then straightened up. Igris immediately made a nimble landing, unlike the other knights that had regularly fallen victim to their momentum. Thud. Jinwoo didn't have time to marvel at its smooth movements. He swiftly ran toward Igris before the knight could turn around and kicked at the monster's face. Despite being unbalanced, Igris could still move its hand with precision. Wham! Igris easily blocked Jinwoo's right leg with its left hand. No way! Jinwoo was incredulous. With one of its opponent's feet out of commission, Igris slammed its fists at Jinwoo's face. Whoosh! Jinwoo instinctively raised his arms to guard, but doing so did nothing to lessen the impact. Bam! His arms flailed as his body flew into the air. Wah! Jinwoo's alarmed gasp quickly turned into a groan of pain. Igris was already in front of him. Jinwoo didn't have time to react before Igris's left fist smashed into the side of his face. Wham! Jinwoo crashed into the ground, his body rebounding and rolling away for a bit. It took a moment for him to get back on his feet. Riying. His ears were ringing. He shook his head hard a few times, and the ringing diminished slightly. But that was the least of his worries. Jinwoo's blurry vision caught sight of Igris striding toward him. Thump, thump! Jinwoo forced his eyes wide open and tensed his legs. Igris came to a stop right in front of him. That was when the true pummeling began. Igris didn't even try to block Jinwoo's strikes, but instead weathered the punches and then delivered its own. Bam! Jinwoo knocked Igris's head slightly to one side, and it swiftly returned the favor even before Jinwoo could retract his arm. Bam! Jinwoo's body swayed. Bam! Igris was pushed back a step this time. Bam! A punch in the gut had Jinwoo doubling over. Gag! He coughed up blood. How is this happening? He currently had a physical damage reduction of over 30%, but each of Igris's punches felt like he was getting whacked around with a hammer. On the other hand, his own attacks weren't doing much damage at all. The battle didn't last long. Bam! Jinwoo's knees eventually buckled. Whump! He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't bear his weight. Whump! And GGGH! Igris wordlessly loomed over him. The knight ignored Jinwoo's befuddled look and outstretched its hand toward its sword across the room, and the blade flew into its hand. The knight gripped the sword with both hands, moved to Jinwoo's side, and raised the point to the sky. Jinwoo realized Igris's plan. It wants to behead me. It was really living up to the title of Knight Commander. When Jinwoo offered no resistance, Igris proceeded with the execution. Of course, Jinwoo had absolutely no intention of going down without a fight. The blade dropped. Whoosh! And as it did, Jinwoo raised his left fist and blocked the strike. Clang! It was the sound of metal hitting metal. The gauntlets Jinwoo had recently acquired protected his hands. Flinch! Jinwoo could tell Igris had been caught off guard. He took this opportunity to deliver a punch with his right fist. As he expected, Igris didn't bother to dodge. You're planning to return the favor again. But the knight hadn't accounted for one thing. Kasaka's venom fang. In a flash, Kasaka's venom fang appeared in Jinwoo's hand, and he drove it into the knight's eye. Shunk! Grawa! The scream that followed sounded inhuman. At the same time, a beam of light shot out of the eye with a dagger in it. Jinwoo pulled himself to his feet. Now what? Taking out one, I wasn't going to end this battle. He needed a finishing move. He was then struck with an idea as he recalled a terrifying attack that had almost killed him once. He decided Igris should get a taste. Jinwoo was already on the move before he realized it. He lowered his stance and wrapped his arms around Igris's waist. Then he started running. Grah! Igris struck Jinwoo's back several times, and the hunter struggled from the pain. Jinwoo gritted his teeth and held on tight. Rather, he sped up. Dash! Your speed has increased by 40%. Jinwoo's legs went faster, and his whole body shook at the velocity. Yes, just like this. He would crush Igris. Keeping a firm grip on his opponent, he hurtled toward a wall. Of course, the impact would also have devastating consequences for him. But he had one more passive skill up his sleeve. The gap closed in a blink of an eye, and the wall was right there. Boom! Igris crashed into the wall. As it did, a notification displayed. Ping. Skill, willpower has been activated, as your HP is below 30%. Your damage will decrease by 50%. The force of the impact was so great, the entire lair quaked briefly. Ugh! Jinwoo stumbled back. Igris was embedded in the wall, but still alive. The fire of life continued burning inside it. I need to end this. Jinwoo pulled Kasaka's venom fang out of Igris's eye, and its body twitched. Jinwoo got a good grip and struck at the knight's throat. Fatal strike. Clang. The attack glanced off. Again. Fatal strike. Clang. Sparks flew. There were now scratches on the metal plate protecting its neck. Again. Fatal strike. Clang. Again. Clang. Again. Clang. And finally, fatal strike. Shunk! Kasaka's venom fang sank deep into its throat. You have defeated Knight Commander Igris the Bloodred. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. Jinwoo raised his arms in victory. He withdrew a couple of steps and then dropped to the ground on his hands and knees as his legs gave way. Huff, huff! He released the breath he had been holding. He'd barely won. It had been extremely close. But is the quest not over? Jinwoo took his time catching his breath, then heaved himself up. He thought killing this creature would be the end of the quest, but the system was silent. Looking around, he noticed that nothing had changed. Well, one thing was different. Several lights were emanating from Igris's prone form. There were items to collect. Let's take care of this first. He had no idea what might happen next, after all. Picking up as many items as he could whenever he could would be the best call. Jinwoo reached out his hand. You have discovered item, Crimson Knight's helmet. Would you like to acquire it? You have discovered rune stone, Ruler's hand. Would you like to acquire it? You have discovered item, leather pouch. Would you like to acquire it? You have discovered item, instant teleportation stone. Would you like to acquire it? There was a startling number of items, which puzzled Jinwoo, but it also delighted him. Acquire all. The leather pouch was the first to be processed. You have opened item, leather pouch. It contains 1,500,000 gold. You have acquired 1,500,000 gold. Jinwoo's eyes went huge. These rewards are on a completely different level. It had been a hard-fought battle, but the rewards made it worthwhile. He hadn't been expecting much from the leather pouch, let alone 1,500,000 gold. He could now afford plenty of worthwhile items from the shop. But Jinwoo's attention was on something else. If an item he didn't expect much from was this good, how valuable would the helmet or rune stone be? He tried to lower his expectations as he brought up the helmet's info. Ping. Item, Crimson Knight's helmet. Acquisition difficulty, S. Category, protective gear. Physical damage decrease, plus 15%. Stamina plus 20, strength plus 20. S rank! Jinwoo whooped. This was his first S rank item. A 15% physical damage decrease would have been good enough, but it would also raise his strength and stamina stats by 20 points. His heart fluttered just looking at the screen. A-rank items can't even compare. He had acquired a couple of A-rank items by this point. The first was Kasaka's venom gland from the snake-like Kasaka, and the second was the Warden's collar from the Hellhound Cerberus. These two items had been fantastic in their own right. Despite the strength penalty, the venom gland had decreased any physical damage taken by 20%. And the Warden's collar? As an item that increased his agility and perception by 20 points each, the collar was one of the best items available. But this new Crimson Knight's helmet offered a boost similar to both those items combined without a stat penalty. It really is the best. Jinwoo was aware he was standing in the middle of a boss lair, but he couldn't stop smiling. That he genuinely liked its design was the cherry on top. Too bad it'll be invisible. The Bloodred helmet with the long flowing mane was like a work of art. For a brief moment, he thought about trying on the full set of armor if he could. However, what could have been? Not all parts of Igris's armor were glowing, so he wasn't permitted to acquire them. The only protective gear that was his for the taking was the helmet. He pushed aside his wishful thinking and carefully pulled on the helmet. As usual, the helmet disappeared instantly. Although he wouldn't be able to show it off, the helmet blew up his stats. Strength 128 plus 20. Stamina 87 plus 20. Agility 107. Intelligence 66. Perception 89. Physical damage reduced by 46% plus 15%. The numbers in the brackets represented the stat increases that came from wearing the helmet. His strength, stamina, and physical damage debuffs had all jumped significantly. He couldn't be more satisfied. His heart raced as he took in the stat changes. Wait, no. He frowned. The quest isn't over, so let's not get too excited just yet. Besides, he had more items to check out. His gaze shifted to the other two items in anticipation. Rune Stone, Ruler's Hand. Item, Instant Teleportation Stone. Of the two walnut-sized stones, the Instant Teleportation Stone grabbed his attention first. I know what rune stones are, but what was an Instant Teleportation Stone? His curiosity was sated when the information screen came up. Ping. Item, Instant Teleportation Stone. Rank, Category, Consumable. This item can be obtained only from a job change quest. Crush the stone to be instantly teleported outside the dungeon. If unused, it will automatically be destroyed once the job change quest ends. Cannot be stored in the inventory. Its activation method was identical to that of a rune stone, except it was for escaping from the dungeon instead of learning a new skill. Wait, the job change quest isn't over yet? If it had been, the stone would have crumbled by now as per the description. Since it was still intact, that could only mean... Jinwoo felt a chill creep up his spine. It was strange. He had just obtained one of the top items that would help him escape the dungeon, yet at that moment, he had an ominous feeling. If this stone could be used in regular dungeons outside the system, all hunters would be scrambling to get their hands on one. This small rock was worth one's life, so what price tag wouldn't they pay? And Jinwoo was no different. The stone took some of the pressure off this quest. If I need to, he could leave the dungeon at any time. However, he couldn't escape the uneasy feeling in the back of his mind. And like he thought, the system sounded an alarm, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Ping. The player has acquired the instant teleportation stone. The job change quest begins now. What the hell? This item triggered the start of the quest? Ji-woo felt faint, like he'd just realized he'd stepped on a landmine. If I'd known this would happen, I would have rested a little more. It was too late for regrets. No matter how experienced or knowledgeable one was, the future was impossible to predict accurately. Ji-woo broke out in a cold sweat. He mentally called up the stat window and checked his HP and fatigue. HP 4, 161/10 270. MP 390/850. Fatigue 61. Fatigue is a little high, but this is still doable. The helmet's stamina buff had also raised both his total and remaining HP, so there was that at least. Ji-woo encouraged himself. I can still do this. His life wouldn't really be in danger, since he held the instant teleportation stone in his hand. However, he couldn't shake the notion that the stone symbolized surrender. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been used to trigger the start of the quest. If I give up on the quest, he would be giving up the chance to change his job. Sweat dripped down his forehead and fell to the floor. He licked his dry lips when the next message arrived. Ping. Dimensional gates will be randomly generated in 10 seconds. Dimensional gates? Instead of an answer, large numbers appeared in midair. 10 seconds. It was obviously a countdown. More messages followed. The player has a choice. The player can either leave the dungeon using the instant teleportation stone. 876. The countdown went on. Or survive as long as possible, gathering as many advancement points as possible, and get promoted to a higher class. Survive? Survive what? Ji-woo exploded in frustration. Despite this, he had already switched out the rune stone for Kasaka's Venom Fang in his inventory and placed the instant teleportation stone in his back pocket. He was a mess, but he was ready for battle. This was who he was. The job change quest will commence shortly. 432. Ji-woo anxiously glared at the timer and then scanned the area, his head turning every which way. Something was happening. The space around him was beginning to warp and distort. 1 second. Good luck. That was odd. It was the first time the system had expressed any emotion. But there was no time to be surprised. Once the countdown hit 0, gates began forming all around the room. Boom, boom. It wasn't just 1 or 2. There were 6 or so in his general area, and even more scattered throughout the room. The timer simultaneously started counting up. 2 seconds. The clock was ticking, and the amount of time elapsed would be converted into advancement points. Ji-woo didn't fully understand what the system had said, but he got the gist. The longer I endure, the stronger I'll get. To be exact, he'd get a better job. He couldn't let this opportunity go to waste. He had plenty of both HP and MP left. I'll give it my all. 3 seconds. With precisely 3 seconds on the clock, a countless number of weaponless knights poured out of the gates near him. Thud, 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 thud. The ground trembled from the sea of silver knights. Their numbers could have overwhelmed Ji-woo, but he had a smile on his face. I can easily take these guys. He was kind of thankful that these knights were his opponents. Had they been monsters at Igris' level, he would have barely lasted a few seconds. First, let's get out of their sight with stealth. He decided to use some of his precious mana. He began fading from view. As predicted, the charging knights all stopped in their tracks. However, a mage has used skill, Eyes of Detection. The system sounded an alerting chime. Ji-woo spun around to pinpoint the noise. What? A mage had emerged from a gate and was casting a spell. Jinwoo caught sight of an eye-shaped symbol floating above its head. As he did, the symbol flashed, and Jinwoo's stealth was deactivated in an instant. Shit! Things were already going downhill. Whip! Whip! The knights, standing at attention like telephone poles, all turned their heads toward Jinwoo at the same time. It was like a scene straight out of a horror movie. The silver wave headed his way. Jinwoo braced himself. Bam! He punched the head off one of the knights coming at him, and it stopped in its tracks. You have defeated a knight. Jinwoo's eyes gleamed. Murderous intent. Skill. Murderous intent has been activated. Debuff. Panic has been activated. All the opponent's abilities will decrease by 50% for 1 minute. The debuff caused a lot of the monsters to slow down, but Jinwoo's MP was now at 90. Murderous intent required 100 mana, so he wouldn't be able to use it again. But I bought myself a minute. Jinwoo set about striking down as many monsters as he could in the span of a minute while they were in this weakened state. Bam! Crack! Bam! KRRK! He crushed his enemies at an incredible speed. Bam! Bam! Crack! But knights were emerging from the gate faster than he could take them down. Thud, 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 thud. Jinwoo checked the time amid the chaos. 3 minutes and 19 seconds. 3 minutes and 19 seconds. How many points did that add up to? Could he leave yet? There was no time to stop and calculate things. Knights continued pouring out of the gates non-stop. Though he had disposed of so many already, it was simply impossible to make out the number of knights now swarming the room. Arg! Eventually, Jinwoo started drowning in the sea of knights. Skill. Willpower has been activated. Skill. Willpower has been activated. His HP took a nosedive and was almost at rock bottom. HP 1036/10 How much time? 5 minutes and 8 seconds. 5 minutes and 8 seconds. He'd lasted as long as he could. Let's get out of here. Trapped in a suffocating cage of silver, Jinwoo struggled to reach his back pocket while surrounded by all that armor. However, tink! The instant teleportation stone slipped from his hand. It bounced off a knight's heel and rolled away. No! Jinwoo desperately reached for the stone, but his hand was blocked by knights. More of them soon started piling on top of him. He was suffocating and found it hard to breathe. Skill. Willpower has been activated. Skill. Willpower has been activated. He was starting to lose consciousness. Bam! Bam! As he began to fade, incessantly struck by knights, he thought he heard someone snickering at him. This is all your fault, isn't it? Why did you choose to stray off the beaten path? Wasn't it miraculous enough for an E-rank hunter to rise, to C, or even be rank? That's all you were capable of in the end. Shut up. You've only got yourself to blame. Shut up. Wham! The knights swarming around Jinwoo were blown away. Even though Jinwoo was near death, there was life in his eyes. His gaze was brimming with malice. It can't end like this. He'd endured so much for this one opportunity. Having been on the bottommost rung his whole life, he craved a seat at the top of society. More than anyone, he knew the sorrows of the weak. Even though he had scratched and clawed his way through life just to survive, all it had gotten him were laughs and jeers. What use is an E rank? What's the association thinking? They should send someone capable, not... I bet he just cowered behind other hunters. He'd been handed a ladder to climb up to the place he gazed at longingly for so long. So how could he be expected to just sit back and stare? Hell no. I remember now. He remembered the voices that had just been echoing in his head. It was their voices, the voices of everyone who had ridiculed him behind his back. Well, they could scoff all they wanted. He'd keep struggling with every breath left in him. It didn't matter if he had 10 HP left or even just 1. He would keep going to the bitter end. He'd fight until he couldn't fight anymore. Ah! Jin-Woo launched himself into the fray. Whack! He threw a punch and dented a knight's chest plate, sending it flying backward and taking down the ones behind it as well. The knight started charging at him once again. Jin-Woo fought back even harder. Bam! 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 It didn't matter if they met Jin-Woo's fist, elbow, knee, or foot. Every enemy that came in contact with him crumpled like a paper doll. Your fatigue is over 70. Your movement will be limited. Jin-Woo slowed as warned, but the malice in his eyes still shone brightly. Knights that didn't go down after 1 or 2 hits would rejoin the brawl, and he would strike them 3 or 4 more times to make sure they stayed down. Crack! 8, 7, 6, 5. Meanwhile, another countdown had started. Absorbed in the battle, Jin-Woo didn't notice it until the countdown had reached single digits. What? Is the quest going to be over? For a moment, he had hopes, but they were quickly dashed. 6 minutes and 27 seconds. The timer was still going, so the countdown didn't seem to be related. 4, 3, 2. Is this a countdown to my death? Something like that had happened before, right when all this started. The system had told him he would die in 2/100ths of a second if he didn't become a player. So if that was the case, Jin-Woo glared fiercely. I'll make it count until the last second. Bam! Crash! 2 more knights went down. However, despite Jin-Woo's determination, his body was a mess. He could barely keep his posture. He had trouble lifting his arms to block the knight's blows. One came at him from the front, another from the rear. Boom! Jin-Woo groaned as they smashed into him from either side. Arg! Other knights pressed in from every angle, as if they didn't want to miss a single opportunity. Besieged, Jin-Woo couldn't move a finger. Thud, 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 thud. The knights continued piling on, and the silver wave became a silver mountain. Jin-Woo's breathing grew labored. Huff, huff! It felt like he was about to suffocate to death. Jin-Woo's hand, which protruded through a gap in the crush of knights, uselessly reached to the sky. HP 93/10 270. It was futile, but still, Jin-Woo didn't give up. Not yet. I can still. As the hand reaching toward the heavens clenched into a fist, the mysterious countdown announced its result. 1-0. You have not completed the daily quest. You will be transferred to the penalty zone.